Sometimes, the greatest treasures are not buried in the earth, but are found in the silent courage of a human heart willing to fight for another. The stagecoach charged like a wild beast along the dusty road to Devil's Canyon. Inside, the air was thick with heat and the scent of stale sweat. Eliza Monroe held tight to her mother, Sarah, whose frail body trembled with every violent jolt of the wagon. Each cough that escaped Sarah's lips was a sharp knife in Eliza's heart, a grim reminder of the consumption that was stealing her away. They were chasing a sliver of hope in the dry air of the West, a cure that felt as distant as the hazy mountains on the horizon. The other passengers, a stern-faced preacher and a weary-looking salesman, kept their distance, their eyes offering a mixture of pity and fear. Eliza ignored them, focusing only on the rise and fall of her mother's chest. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed like a rifle shot. The stagecoach lurched violently to one side, its iron-rimmed wheels splintering apart. For a terrifying moment, the wagon teetered on two wheels at the very edge of a deep, rocky ravine. Panic erupted inside the cramped cabin. The salesman shouted, and the preacher began to pray in a loud, frantic voice. The horses screamed in terror. In the chaos, the flimsy door burst open, swinging wildly on its leather hinges. Thrown off balance by another lurch, Eliza lost her grip and tumbled out into the blinding sunlight, her own scream lost in the noise. The world became a blur of spinning sky and jagged rocks rushing up to meet her. Just as the abyss beckoned, a strong arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her back from the precipice with surprising force. Her rescuer was a silent Native American man, his face a mask of calm focus amid the chaos. The townsfolk called him Shadow, for he moved with a quiet grace that made him seem a part of the wild land itself. Without a word, he helped her to her feet, his grip firm and reassuring. He then moved swiftly to assist the driver and the other passengers, ensuring the horses were calmed and the wagon was stabilized. By the time the dust had settled and Eliza had caught her breath, he was gone, melting back into the scrub and canyons as if he had never been there. The incident left an indelible mark on Eliza's soul. Back at their small, dilapidated cabin on the outskirts of town, the memory of his silent strength was a stark contrast to her own bleak reality. She watched her father, Jedediah, lose himself in a bottle of whiskey, his spirit broken long ago. Her mother's condition seemed to worsen with every passing day. To thank the man who had saved her, Eliza took a small knife and a branch of willow wood. With patient, careful strokes, she began to carve the shape of a songbird, pouring all of her unspoken gratitude and a fragile, desperate hope into the small piece of wood. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like the only meaningful thing she could do. A few days passed. The small wooden bird felt smooth and warm in Eliza's palm. She knew she had to give it to him. Clinging to the whispers she had heard in town, she made her way to a secluded spring, nestled among the tall red rocks, the only place where the man they called Shadow was said to appear. Her boots crunched on the dry earth, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound silence of the canyon. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and resolve. She was stepping into a world unknown to her. Driven by a debt of gratitude she felt compelled to repay, no matter the risk to her reputation in a town that distrusted outsiders. She found him there, by the clear, cool water. He was leaning against a large, sun-warmed boulder, his hat tipped low over his eyes, seemingly asleep. In repose, the stern lines of his face softened. The harsh sun cast shadows that sculpted his high cheekbones and strong jaw, making him appear younger, less intimidating, almost vulnerable. The sight stilled the frantic beating of her heart. He was not the fearsome figure of town gossip, but a man at peace with the wilderness that surrounded him. For a long moment, Eliza simply stood and watched, a silent observer in his solitary world. The air was still, broken only by the gentle murmur of the spring. Moving with the care of a fawn, she stepped closer, her worn dress whispering against the dry brush. She was so close now she could see the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest. He did not stir. A wave of doubt washed over her. What was she doing here? What would he think of her, of this foolish little gift? She should turn back, leave him to his peace. But the memory of his arm pulling her from the edge of the ravine, of his calm presence in the face of death pushed her forward. The desire to connect, to show her thanks, was a powerful current that she could not resist. It was a risk she had to take. Gathering every ounce of her courage, she knelt beside him. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached out and gently placed the carved songbird on the flat surface of a rock near his hand. The polished wood seemed to glow in the afternoon sun. It was a small, silent offering, a confession of gratitude that words could not capture. She did not speak. She did not dare to touch him. Then, with her cheeks burning hot, she rose to her feet, turned, and hurried back the way she came, her heart a wild thing in her chest. She did not look back, but she could feel his presence behind her, as vast and silent as the canyon itself. Long after the whisper of Eliza's footsteps had faded into the vast silence of the canyon, Kime opened his eyes. His name was Kime, a word that meant secret in the tongue of his people. He had been aware of her presence from the moment her scent, a faint mix of soap and wood smoke, had drifted to him on the breeze. He had sensed her hesitation, her inner battle between fear and determination, and had remained still, giving her the space she needed. His gaze fell upon the small wooden bird resting on the rock. It was a simple thing, yet crafted with an unmistakable tenderness that spoke volumes. The detail in its tiny wings was remarkable. He picked it up, the smooth wood feeling strangely comforting in his calloused palm. He ran a thumb over the carefully carved feathers. A warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he had not known since the days his mother had told him stories by the firelight, before his world had been shattered. This girl, with her quiet sorrow and fierce spirit, had offered him a piece of kindness without expectation. It was a rare and precious thing. Carefully, he placed the songbird inside his leather pouch, next to a smooth river stone and a single eagle feather. It was more than a gift. It was a connection, a silent promise in a world that had taught him only silence and distrust. Meanwhile, a different kind of shadow fell over the Monroe homestead. Silas Blackwood, a man whose wealth and cruelty were the stuff of local legend, rode up to their cabin. His fine black coat and polished boots were an insult to the poverty that clung to the place. He was the owner of the Golden Canyon Saloon, and he held the deed to nearly every business and piece of land in the county, including theirs. He dismounted, his spurs jingling with an arrogant rhythm. He did not bother to knock, simply leaned against a porch post and addressed Jedediah, who had stumbled outside, blinking in the harsh light. "The debt is due, Jedediah. Your time is up." Blackwood's cold, calculating eyes then shifted to Eliza as she appeared in the doorway behind her father. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. "However," he continued, his voice dropping to an oily purr, "perhaps we can come to another arrangement." His gaze roamed over Eliza in a way that made her skin crawl, as if he were inspecting livestock at an auction. He was a vulture circling, and she was the prey. The unspoken threat hung heavy in the air, a poison that seeped into the very foundations of their home. This visit was not about money, it was about possession. And Blackwood had just decided what he wanted to own. The days that followed were suffocating. Sarah's cough grew worse, a dry, rattling sound that echoed through the small cabin day and night. Crushed by Blackwood's looming threat, Jedediah retreated further into the whiskey bottle, his despair a tangible presence in the room. But then, small miracles began to appear. One morning, Eliza found a freshly caught rabbit on the porch step. The next, a bundle of herbs, whose earthy aroma she recognized from her mother's old remedies, lay in the same spot. The tea she brewed from them seemed to soothe Sarah's lungs, granting her moments of precious, peaceful rest. Eliza held the knowledge of the giver close to her heart. She knew the gifts were from Kame. This silent, steady provision was a lifeline in their sea of troubles. It was a secret conversation between them, carried on the morning breeze. The thought of him, out there in the vast wilderness, thinking of her family, gave her a strength she did not know she possessed. It was a fragile flame of hope in the encroaching darkness. She would often find herself looking toward the red cliffs, wondering where he was, what he was doing. Their connection, forged in a moment of terror and sealed with a simple wooden bird, was now her most treasured secret, a source of quiet comfort. In town, Blackwood's cruelty took a more public form. His two hired thugs, a hulking man named Lyle and a wiry one named Finch, cornered Jedediah outside the general store. They mocked him for his poverty and his drinking, their laughter echoing down the dusty street. When Jedediah, fueled by a flicker of old pride, tried to stand up for himself, they beat him without mercy, leaving him bruised and broken in the dirt. Sheriff Brody, a good man shackled by Blackwood's influence, could only watch from his office window, his face a grim mask of helplessness. He knew interfering would only make things worse for everyone. The public beating shattered the last of Jedediah's spirit. He now drank not to forget but to disappear. At the same time, Lyle and Finch, following Blackwood's orders, began spreading vicious rumors. They spoke in loud whispers in the saloon and the mercantile, painting Eliza as a loose woman who consorted with a heathen savage. The townsfolk, already wary of the Monroes, began to shun them completely. Doors closed as Eliza passed. Women pulled their children closer. The family was now utterly alone, trapped in a cage of poverty, sickness, and slander, with the bars forged by Silas Blackwood himself. The crisis reached its breaking point. Sarah's fever spiked, and she grew delirious, her weak cries filling the cabin. In a panic, Eliza ran into town for Dr. Miller, but the man, whose practice was housed in a building owned by Blackwood, refused to even see her. "No payment, no visit," he stated flatly, not bothering to look up from his papers. "I am not a charity." His cold refusal was a death sentence. Eliza returned home, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. The feeling of utter helplessness was a physical thing, a crushing pressure that made it hard to breathe. The world had turned its back on them. The next afternoon, Silas Blackwood rode up to the cabin again, his presence like a storm cloud on the horizon. He dismounted with a deliberate, confident air and waited on the porch. He did not have to wait long. Jedediah came out, his hands trembling, followed by Eliza, her face pale but her eyes defiant. Blackwood surveyed them for a moment, a predator enjoying the fear of his cornered prey. Then he unveiled his proposition, his voice smooth and reasonable, which only made it more monstrous. He laid out his terms with the precision of a master trapper setting his steel jaws. "I will tear up your debt," he began, letting the words hang in the air. "And I will send Dr. Miller here with all the medicine your mother needs." He paused, letting the impossible hope sink in before delivering the killing blow. "In return, Eliza will come to work for me at the Golden Canyon Saloon." Jedediah let out a strangled cry. "No! You will not have her." He knew exactly what kind of work Blackwood had in mind. It was not about serving drinks. It was about serving him. It was a form of bondage from which there would be no escape, a life of degradation under his thumb. But Eliza looked from Blackwood's smug face to the cabin door, behind which her mother was fighting for every breath. The choice was no choice at all. It was a sacrifice. "I will do it," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but clear and steady. The words felt like stones in her mouth. She ignored her father's desperate pleas and met Blackwood's triumphant gaze without flinching. In that moment, she walked willingly into the trap, trading her freedom for her mother's life. Blackwood smiled, a cold, satisfied expression. The bargain was struck. The price was set, and Eliza Monroe was now his. The Golden Canyon Saloon was a circle of hell. The air was a foul mixture of cheap whiskey, sweat, and cigar smoke. By day, Eliza scrubbed floors until her knees were raw, and her back screamed in protest. By night, she served drinks to leering cowboys and prospectors, enduring their crude jokes and clumsy attempts to touch her. Through it all, she felt Silas Blackwood's eyes on her. He would sit at his corner table, watching her, a smug look of ownership on his face. He never touched her, not yet. He was savoring his victory, enjoying her public humiliation, letting the weight of her servitude crush her spirit piece by piece. Keme had grown uneasy. The small gifts he left on the porch remained untouched. The cabin seemed unnaturally still. His disquiet drove him toward the town, a place he usually avoided. He found Sheriff Brody mending a saddle outside his office. The lawman's face was etched with a deep weariness. Brody respected Keme, seeing in him an honor that was absent in men like Blackwood. He hesitated, then told him the truth. "Blackwood has her, Kame. She is working at the saloon to pay for her mother's medicine." The words struck Kame like a physical blow. He understood instantly the true nature of her work. That night, Kime moved through the back alleys of Devil's Canyon like a phantom. The raucous noise of the saloon spilled out into the darkness. From the shadows across the street, he watched the swinging doors. He saw her then. She was carrying a heavy tray of glasses, her steps slow and leaden. The vibrant spark he had seen in her eyes at the spring was gone, replaced by a dull, hollow emptiness. Her dress was plain and worn, but even in the dim light he could see the exhaustion etched on her face. She looked like a caged bird, her wings clipped, her song silenced. His fists clenched as he watched a drunken trapper grab her arm, spinning her around. The man's laughter was a harsh, ugly sound. Eliza pulled away, her face a mask of quiet despair, before moving on to the next table. The brief, brutal interaction confirmed his worst fears. This was not a job. It was a torment. The sight of her suffering, of her quiet dignity being stripped away in that vile place, ignited a fire in his soul. It was a cold, silent rage, more dangerous than any loud explosion. He knew then that he could not stand by. He would not. He would tear down the cage, whatever the cost. The image of Eliza's haunted face was burned into Kame's mind. He returned to his hidden camp in the high canyons, the cold rage solidifying into a clear, unshakable purpose. Leaving rabbits and herbs on a porch was the act of a hopeful observer. What was needed now was the act of a warrior. The time for silent gestures was over. Blackwood understood only one language: power and currency. And Keme would speak to him in terms he could not ignore. He began to gather his possessions, the sum total of a life lived apart from the white man's world of fences and deeds. He unrolled his finest pelts, the silver-tipped fur of a wolf hunted in the dead of winter, the rich, dark coats of beaver trapped in the high mountain streams. These were worth a small fortune in the right hands. From a small leather pouch he emptied a handful of raw gold nuggets, gleaned over years from a secret creek bed. They shone with a dull, heavy light in the flickering firelight. Each one represented days of patient labor, of sifting through sand and stone. They were his security, his freedom from the world of commerce, and he was now prepared to give them all away. Finally, he drew out his most sacred possession. It was a silver amulet, intricately carved with the symbol of the hawk, passed down from his father, who had been a great chief. It was not just metal, it was memory, identity, a link to the ancestors who had roamed these lands freely. It was the last piece of his past, a symbol of the honor and strength of his people. To part with it was to part with a piece of his soul. But as he held it in his hand, he saw Eliza's face, and he knew that no sacrifice was too great to restore the light to her eyes. He understood this transaction would be fraught with peril. Blackwood was not a man of honor. A deal with him was a dance with a snake. Keme took out his Winchester rifle, its wooden stock smooth and familiar in his hands. He cleaned and oiled every part with meticulous care. He checked the action of his revolver, ensuring it was swift and reliable. He was not just preparing for a trade, he was preparing for a battle. He knew that to free Eliza he might have to walk through fire. And as he looked up at the stars wheeling in the vast, dark sky, he accepted his path. The sun was high and unforgiving when Keme rode into Devil's Canyon. He moved not with stealth but with a deliberate, challenging calm. Townsfolk stopped and stared as he dismounted in front of the Golden Canyon Saloon. He tied his horse to the hitching post and, without a backward glance, pushed through the swinging doors. The saloon, half full with midday drinkers, fell into an immediate, shocked silence. All eyes turned to him as he walked to the center of the room. Blackwood sat at his usual table, a deck of cards in his hand, a look of amused contempt on his face. Keme met his gaze and threw the heavy deerskin sack onto the table. It landed with a solid thud. The gold nuggets inside made a satisfying clink. "This is for the girl," Keme said. His voice was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the silent room, each word as solid and unyielding as a river stone. For a moment, Blackwood was speechless. Then he let out a short, harsh laugh. The tension in the room thickened. Eliza, who had been wiping down the bar, froze, her eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning, terrifying hope. "She is not for sale, savage." Blackwood sneered, recovering his composure. He nodded to Lyle and Finch, who were standing near the bar. "Show our guests the door." As his two thugs started forward, Kame moved with a speed that defied belief. His revolver seemed to leap into his hand. 2 shots rang out, deafening in the enclosed space. Lyle and Finch cried out and fell to the floor, clutching their legs. They were alive, but they were no longer a threat. The room erupted in panic as men scrambled for cover. Blackwood's face twisted into a mask of pure fury. As Blackwood lunged for his own revolver, the saloon doors burst open again. Sheriff Brody stood there, his own weapon drawn. "Drop it, Blackwood!" "It is over," he yelled. But Blackwood was beyond reason. Seeing his power challenged so publicly had driven him mad. In a desperate act of defiance, he fired, not at Kame, but at the sheriff. The bullet struck Brody in the shoulder, spinning him around. The act was a calculated diversion, a final, violent play in a game he had just lost. In that moment of chaos, he sealed his own fate. The instant Blackwood fired at the sheriff, the saloon exploded into chaos. It was the opening Kime needed. He moved through the panicked crowd, his focus entirely on Eliza. He grabbed her hand, his touch firm but gentle. "Come," was all he said. She did not hesitate. Together they ran from the saloon into the harsh sunlight. Blackwood, enraged, appeared in the doorway, firing his revolver wildly after them. Bullets splintered the wooden hitching post as Kime lifted Eliza onto his horse and swung up behind her. He dug his heels into the horse's flanks, and they galloped out of town. They rode hard through the afternoon and into the night, leaving Devil's Canyon far behind. The rhythmic pounding of the horse's hooves was the only sound in the vast, moonlit landscape. They did not stop until they reached Kame's camp, a sheltered alcove hidden by ancient junipers. He built a small, smokeless fire and gently tended to the scrapes on her arms from her fall in the saloon. He gave her water from his canteen and a piece of dried venison. Few words passed between them, but in the shared silence, a profound understanding grew. For the first time in months, Eliza felt safe. Back in Devil's Canyon, Blackwood's reckless act of shooting the sheriff had shattered his iron grip on the town. Wounding the law, even a lawman as hamstrung as Brody, was a line that could not be uncrossed. Men who had once feared him now looked at him with open contempt. His authority had evaporated in a single puff of gunsmoke. When Jedediah heard what had transpired, something shifted within him. The news of his daughter's rescue, of Kime's brave stand, rekindled a long-dormant ember of pride and paternal duty in his whiskey-soaked soul. For the first time in years, Jedediah pushed the bottle away. He walked with a new, steady purpose to the dilapidated shed behind their cabin. Inside, covered in dust and cobwebs, was their old buckboard wagon. The wheels were cracked, the harness brittle. With a determination he had not felt since his wife first fell ill, he began the laborious work of repairing it. He was no longer a man waiting to die. He was a father preparing to save his family, to take them away from the poison of this town and start anew. He worked through the night, his hands finding their old skill. At first light, Kimi and Eliza rode back to the Monroe homestead. They found Jedediah by the newly repaired wagon, his face tired but his eyes clear and sober. When he saw them, he stood tall. He looked from his daughter's safe return to the quiet man beside her. He walked forward and, without a word, extended his hand to Kime. Kime took it, and the two men shook, a silent agreement passing between them. It was a gesture of respect, of gratitude, and of peace. The enmity between them, born of fear and prejudice, was finally laid to rest. Later, as Jedediah helped Sarah take a few weak steps in the morning sun, Eliza found Kime by the creek. "I do not know how to thank you," she began, her voice thick with emotion. In response, he reached into his leather pouch and drew out the small wooden songbird. He held it out to her on his palm. "It has been with me always," he said softly. "And I was not asleep that day at the spring. I did not want to frighten you." His confession was a greater gift than any amount of gold or silver. It was the gift of truth. Tears of pure joy streamed down Eliza's face. The months of fear, sorrow, and sacrifice melted away in the warmth of his gaze. She finally understood the depth of his quiet, steady devotion. They both knew they could not stay. Blackwood was a wounded animal, and he would eventually come for revenge. Their only hope was to leave, to seek a new life far from the reach of his corrupting influence. They had to move quickly, before Blackwood could rally what was left of his power and come after them. Their future lay to the west, in the unknown territories. Within a few days, Sarah had regained enough strength to travel. They packed their few belongings into the sturdy wagon. As they prepared to leave, Jedediah made a decision. "I will stay," he said, his voice firm. "I will give you a day's head start. I owe you that." It was his final act of redemption. As the sun began to climb the eastern sky, Kemay and Eliza, holding hands, led the wagon away from the cabin. They looked ahead to the vast, open plains, a future they would face together. Behind them, they left the shadows of Devil's Canyon. Before them lay a new life, built on courage, sacrifice, and a love that had bloomed in the harshest of soils.